In 1985, the biggest pop band in the world didn't break up with an announcement. There was no final tour, no dramatic press statement, no headline declaring the end. Instead, Duran Duran quietly split into two different groups at the exact moment they were supposed to be unstoppable. Half the band recorded one album, the other half recorded another. They even appeared together at Live Aid as if nothing had changed, but behind the scenes, the classic lineup was already over. The fracture had happened months earlier, and most fans never realized they were watching the moment Duran Duran stopped being one band. By 1984, Duran Duran had become something very few bands ever achieve at the same time: a chart-dominating pop act, a visual MTV phenomenon, and a global touring force with influence across both Europe and the United States. Albums like Rio and Seven and the Ragged Tiger didn't just sell millions, they reshaped how image, fashion, and music could work together in the video era. But inside the band, success was already beginning to change the balance that had defined them from the start. The group had never been built around a single leader. Instead, it operated as a five-person identity: Simon Le Bon as lyricist and voice, Nick Rhodes shaping atmosphere and visual style, and John Taylor, Andy Taylor, and Roger Taylor driving the band's rhythm and energy. That balance helped make their early success feel unified rather than manufactured. But by the time the Seven and the Ragged Tiger World Tour ended, something subtle had shifted. Media coverage increasingly treated Simon as the spokesperson. Interviews centered on him. MTV framed him as the face of the group. Record industry expectations began to follow that narrative. None of this caused an immediate break, but it quietly altered how the band functioned. For the first time, Duran Duran were no longer moving in a single direction. They were becoming two different versions of the same band without realizing it yet. By 1985, the members of Duran Duran were no longer imagining the same future for the band. The shift did not happen overnight, and it did not begin with an argument. Instead, it appeared gradually as each member started exploring what kind of music they wanted to make after the exhausting global success of Seven and the Ragged Tiger. For the first time since their rise from the Birmingham club scene, the group's creative instincts were pulling in opposite directions. On one side, Simon Le Bon and Nick Rhodes were increasingly drawn toward a more atmospheric and cinematic sound. Their interests leaned into layered synthesizers, visual storytelling, and the European art-pop identity that had originally defined the band's aesthetic. They wanted to expand the mood-driven direction hinted at in tracks like The Chauffeur, pushing Duran Duran towards something more experimental and stylized. On the other side, John Taylor and Andy Taylor were moving toward a tougher, groove-oriented sound shaped by American funk, rhythm and blues, and rock radio. They were inspired by live band energy and stripped-down arrangements that contrasted sharply with the polished textures the group had become known for. Even Roger Taylor, increasingly exhausted by touring, found himself reconsidering what role he wanted music to play in his life at all. These differences did not immediately threaten the band's existence, but they revealed something important. Duran Duran were no longer a single creative unit reacting to the same influences at the same time. They were beginning to imagine two incompatible versions of what the band could become next. From the beginning, Duran Duran had presented itself as a collective identity rather than a singer-led group. Unlike many pop acts of the early MTV era, each member contributed to the band's visual image, musical direction, and public personality. But by the mid-1980s, that balance was quietly changing, not inside the studio first, but in the way the outside world began describing them. As the band's popularity expanded across America, journalists increasingly focused their attention on Simon Le Bon. He was the lyricist, the most visible performer in music videos, and the member most comfortable handling interviews. Television appearances and magazine profiles gradually positioned him as the spokesperson, even when the group itself still operated democratically behind the scenes. Over time, that shift created a subtle but important difference between how the band saw itself and how it was being presented to audiences.
This change was not the result of ego or internal rivalry. It was largely a consequence of how MTV-era pop storytelling worked. Media outlets preferred recognizable front figures, and Simon's role naturally fit that expectation. Still, the effect inside the band was real. When coverage began treating Duran Duran as if it revolved around one voice instead of 5 collaborators, it altered perceptions of authorship and influence, both publicly and privately. Meanwhile, Nick Rhodes remained central to the group's visual and sonic identity, while John Taylor, Andy Taylor, and Roger Taylor continued shaping its rhythm-driven core. But by 1985, the narrative surrounding the band had already begun to shift. Outside observers increasingly saw a frontman leading a group that had originally been designed without one. That perception would soon make the coming split easier to misunderstand and harder to prevent.
The moment the internal divide inside Duran Duran became visible did not arrive as an argument or a departure announcement. Instead, it appeared in 1985 through 2 side projects that quietly showed the band were no longer moving forward together. For the first time, members began recording separate albums at the exact moment their success was supposed to carry them into a unified next phase. On one side, Simon Le Bon and Nick Rhodes worked with Roger Taylor on Arcadia, a project that emphasized layered production, cinematic arrangements, and a more atmospheric continuation of Duran Duran's art-pop identity. The music suggested a future built on texture, mood, and visual storytelling rather than guitar-driven immediacy. At the same time, John Taylor and Andy Taylor formed the Power Station alongside Robert Palmer. Their sound moved in the opposite direction: heavier rhythms, stripped-down funk influences, and a deliberately raw energy designed to connect with American rock radio. It was not a temporary experiment so much as an alternative blueprint for what Duran Duran could become. Importantly, these projects were not presented publicly as signs of conflict. At the time, they were framed as creative breathing space after years of non-stop touring and recording. But the reality was more significant. For the first time, the 5 members were no longer testing ideas within the same studio environment. They were building 2 separate musical futures in parallel. Once those futures existed, returning to a single shared direction became far more difficult than anyone outside the band realized. In June 1985, just as the internal direction of Duran Duran was already beginning to shift, an unexpected event involving Simon Le Bon altered the timing of everything that followed. While competing in the Fastmet race aboard his yacht Drum, Le Bon's vessel capsized off the coast of Cornwall after its keel failed. He and the crew were trapped inside the overturned hull before being rescued. For several minutes, it appeared possible that the singer might not survive. The accident immediately drew international media attention. At a moment when the band were already working separately on Arcadia and the Power Station, the incident shifted focus back onto Simon as an individual rather than the group as a collective. Public concern centered on his recovery, while the broader uncertainty surrounding the band's future remained largely unspoken. Inside Duran Duran's timeline, however, the significance of the accident was more subtle. It did not cause the split that followed, but it interrupted a period when the members were already operating independently. Recording schedules paused, promotional plans changed, and the fragile sense that the classic 5-piece lineup might soon regroup became harder to maintain. The momentum that once kept the band moving together slowed at exactly the wrong moment. At the same time, Roger Taylor had already begun stepping back from the intensity of touring life, and Andy Taylor was increasingly committed to work outside the band's traditional structure. The accident did not create those decisions, but it marked the point where the possibility of returning quickly to the original lineup began to fade.
When Duran Duran walked onto the stage at Live Aid in July 1985, they still appeared to the world as the same 5-piece lineup that had dominated global pop throughout the early decade. To audiences watching from Wembley Stadium and millions more around the world, nothing suggested that the group was already moving toward a permanent structural change. But internally, This performance marked something far more significant than another high-profile appearance. It was the last time the classic lineup would stand together before the break became irreversible. By this point, Arcadia and the Power Station had already revealed how far the members' musical interests had diverged. The Live Aid appearance did not reverse that shift. Instead, it briefly reunited 5 musicians whose creative paths were already separating. What looked like continuity from the outside was in reality a final public moment of alignment before the band moved into different directions. The performance itself also attracted unexpected attention for another reason. During A View to a Kill, Simon Le Bon's vocal strain produced a widely discussed note that became one of the most replayed moments of the set. Although minor in musical terms, it added to the growing sense that the band's momentum was changing at precisely the moment their visibility was highest. Soon afterward, Roger Taylor stepped away from the group entirely, choosing not to return to its demanding touring structure. The appearance at Live Aid would later be recognized not as a continuation of Duran Duran's peak era, but as the final public snapshot of the lineup that had defined it.
In the months following Live Aid, the internal shift inside Duran Duran moved from possibility to reality. What had previously been a creative divergence between side projects now became a structural change that permanently altered the group's identity. The first decisive step came when Roger Taylor chose not to return to the band's demanding touring and recording schedule. Unlike earlier pauses in activity, this was not presented as temporary. It marked the quiet end of his role in the original 5-member lineup. Soon after, a second departure followed under more complicated circumstances. As work began on what would become the Notorious album, Andy Taylor initially remained involved in recording sessions, but disagreements about direction and commitment gradually made his position uncertain. By the time the album moved toward completion, he was no longer part of the project. For the first time since the band's formation, Duran Duran were continuing as a 3-piece centered around Simon Le Bon, Nick Rhodes, and John Taylor. Importantly, these departures did not arrive as a dramatic public breakup. There was no single announcement marking the end of the classic lineup. Instead, the transition unfolded gradually enough that many listeners did not immediately recognize how significant the change was. But inside the band's history, this was the moment when the original structure that had defined their early success finally disappeared. From this point forward, Duran Duran would continue, but no longer as the same group that had created their global breakthrough.
Section 8. The moment Duran Duran became a different band. By the time Duran Duran returned with Notorious in 1986, the transformation that had begun quietly 2 years earlier was complete. The group that audiences saw on television and heard on radio was still recognizably Duran Duran, but it no longer operated as the 5-member unit that had defined their rise during the Rio era. Without Roger Taylor and Andy Taylor, the internal balance that shaped their early identity had permanently shifted. The new lineup centered around Simon Le Bon, Nick Rhodes, and John Taylor, working closely with producer Nile Rodgers. His influence helped redefine the band's sound, moving it toward a tighter, groove-driven style that reflected contemporary funk and rhythm-based pop rather than the layered new wave textures of their earlier recordings. The shift was deliberate. It allowed the group to continue forward instead of attempting to recreate a version of itself that no longer existed. From the outside, this looked like a confident reinvention. Inside the band's history, however, it marked the end of something more specific. The original creative structure that balanced 5 distinct personalities had quietly dissolved between 1984 and 1986, replaced by a streamlined trio adapting to a different musical landscape. What made this transition unusual was how little attention it received at the time. There was no single announcement declaring that the classic lineup was over. Instead, the defining change had already happened earlier, during the moment when Arcadia and the Power Station revealed that Duran Duran were no longer moving in one direction together. Everything after that was simply the result.